Genshin Impact has been online for about 4 years now. Damn, I feel old. With more than 90 playable characters as of version 5.1. So that, hey y'all, welcome to my ranking of every playable character in Genshin Impact. Every character will be rated based on my opinion of how they play, their power scaling, and value on an account in alphabetical order. I'll rate every character based on a number, then putting them on a tier list. This is my own opinion, and if you want to disagree with it, feel free to do so in the comments. But let's get to it, shall we? We do have 92 characters to go through after all. Albedo was the first big source of off-field geo damage in the game, coming out in 1.2. I felt like a dumbass when I initially decided to skip Zhongli for him, and still kinda regret it to this day. He has a place in my Ito team now, but I'm more or less looking to replace him with Chiori. His main off-field playstyle was a cool novelty at the time, but it's not even full off-field. You still have to hit enemies for him to do damage. He's fine, but nowhere near the highest priority to pull for if you're looking for off-field damage. 6 out of 10. Alhaitham is an amazing Dendro Hyper Carry Quick Swap hybrid character. He's got a different playstyle and does some ludicrous damage for it. He takes on some interesting mechanics that you have to be somewhat engaged in to fully make use of, but that's what makes him fun. 9 out of 10. Aloy. Does anyone know what she does? Okay, that's not right. More like, does anyone know how to make her not completely dog shit? I'm gonna take that as a no. 0 out of 10. You know, can't believe I'm saying this, but Amber is not completely worthless. Okay, it's not hard to be Aloy, but still. At least Baron Bunny is a taunt that can be self-detonated with one of her constellations. If nothing else, she has one of the best ways to burn a cryo shield because of her burst has no ICD. And hey, if not even that, she can work as an elegy support. She can light torches? Not the worst character, just probably the worst beginner character. 4 out of 10. Arataki Ito, my man, is kinda mid nowadays. Don't get me wrong, I still love the guy and how he plays and... Ushi? But there is always a better option when it comes to characters that are strictly meant to do damage. 7 out of 10. Arlecchino is really fun to play and also one of the top pyro DPS in the game. Getting around the fact that she can only be healed by herself, she's simple to play and does a lot of damage. 9 out of 10. I personally don't have Baiju, but hey, a healer shield all-in-one while also being Dendro is just a good idea. His shields are not the impenetrable type, but as far as interruption resistance goes, it does that pretty well. Not the most fun though. 7 out of 10. Go Barbara is what I would say if she was all that good. While she is one of the better candidates for a Nilou Bloom team, or as a fanfare filler for Farina, that's pretty much all she has. And since she is just a dedicated healer for the most part, she's pretty boring to play, all things considered. 6 out of 10. Next is the Captain of the Crux, Beidou. She's pretty damn good. She was already considered really good at the beginning and got even better with Dendro. You can't tell me summoning dragon-shaped lightning that also jumps between enemies to do damage isn't cool. But my god, that energy sometimes. 8 out of 10. Bennett. What else do I need to say? Busted. Just busted overall. Pyro, crazy good healing, a huge attack buff, really good damage should you want to build him for it, and the potential to buff attack more, or EM with the Noblesse and Instructor sets respectively. As the cherry on top, he is a 4-star in the Stardust shop, so he's super accessible. Bennett is one of the characters closest to deserving the title of best character. 10 out of 10. Candace. Fun Hydro Infusion encounter, but besides that, a pretty nothing shield. Missed opportunity too. If she were a pure Hydro shielder, I think she would have had her place in some teams. 4 out of 10. Charlotte! The journalist from the Steambird puts the Liyuan zombie to shame. No, seriously. Charlotte is a healer, but not just any healer. A team-wide burst healer. While she may have some problems getting her burst back on cooldown, she does a hell of a lot better than Chi-Chi ever could, especially with how Charlotte can use the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers. 6 out of 10. As the captain of the Special Security Patrol of Fontaine, Chevra's makes Overloaded not as bad as it usually would be otherwise. Her main gimmick is like the overloaded version of Nilo teams, wherein you only want Electro and Pyro characters, and she will reduce enemy resistance to both of those elements. Of course, this doesn't make it good, but it's not as bad. 6 out of 10. Chiori is a better albedo with some added perks. Same sort of deal, except without having to worry about a circle or your source of damage being broken. Granted, the time between hits is longer for Chiori, but you can get around that by having another character that creates geo-constructs. What's more is that she also scales off of her attack on top of her defense, giving her more options for buffers. 7 out of 10. Chongyun is a character that just fell off really hard, and really early too. As a cryo support slash burst DPS hybrid, if there were other characters that did more, that was the end for him. And it didn't take long for that to happen. Only thing stopping you was whether you had those better characters or not. At least he has a cryo infusion. 4 out of 10. Chlorand is pretty damn good. Completely invincible long-range attacker moveset so long as you don't get hit, with how she uses the Bond of Life mechanic and healing herself from it. All of this makes her a crazy good Quicken or Hyper Bloom driver. Or Taser or Overloaded, I guess. Never mind that she is pretty fun to control as well, having to weave in a few normal attacks between dashes from her skill. Not enough to be a high value pull, but definitely good enough if you want some on-field electro damage. Kole is free, therefore not too bad, and pretty decent as what is probably your first Dendro character. Still adheres to the age-old law of circle impact in Genshin, but I digress. Average skill burst character, but hey, it's Dendro! 7 out of 10. What can I say about Scion? For starters, he's good, or at least he can be. Sino's core gameplay can be fun, having to time his skill with the purple eye that comes on screen every so often, and he can do a lot of damage relative to his competition. Now for the problems. Sino's gameplay is entirely locked behind having his burst up. Now, there are a few other characters like this, but Sino's is particularly problematic. With the way Sino wants to be played, he wants to stay on field for as long as possible. Again, not a thing exclusive to him. The problem is that as long as possible means 18 seconds for him. Guess what? Most characters' abilities don't last that long in this game, which means there will likely be a prolonged period of downtime where little to no damage is being done because it's pure electro. There are some characters that can help with some of those problems, but they're not perfect solutions. Look, I can cover this more in another video, but the point is, he can be good, but there's no single perfect character that is built to draw it out of him. 6 out of 10. If you were to look up the definition of missed opportunity, you would see her. If you wanted an explanation for what is wrong for a good quarter of the playable characters, she is that explanation personified. Please give a warm welcome to the Jester of Sumeru, Dea. Hoyo actually went. Here's a badass female character. We're making her playable. And let's make her incomplete, half-assed, and throw her on the permanent banner so you can lose to a character that makes you feel worse than getting a Chi-Chi. Holy missed potential. Go figure. Two characters that I could make entire videos for, one after the other. But to summarize, damage reduction and transfer from her skill that doesn't lead to anything else but being worse than a shield. Yes, not even a revenge mechanic. That same damage reduction field gives super armor, but only for half the entire duration. The skill having 8 seconds of full downtime, only lowered by a constellation when it was already mediocre to begin with. And of course, her burst does terrible damage and will be cancelled should you decide to jump. That last part is kind of whatever. But why does it do that? The missed opportunity to end all missed opportunities in all of Genshin. Most people playing through the story liked her. This was Hoyo's guaranteed pull and they still fumbled. Little editor's note here, after the release of Natlan and some of its characters, namely Molani and Kanich, Dea can see more use. Since Molani is designed around being able to forward vaporize and Kanich around burning, Dea's periodic application and interruption resistance fills an oddly specific yet welcome niche in those teams. 6 out of 10. Coming off of that, we have the character with the biggest redemption arc of the game, and pretty much the character that got me into the game, Diluc. When he came out, which is to say when the game came out, he was the top DPS in the game, but that was really short-lived after the Leeway Big 3 released. So for a while, he was underwhelming, to the point where he was seen as another true loss from the 50-50. Until just a few months ago when Scion came out to finally make use of Diluc's plunging attack scaling, which is also the highest in the game. With that, Diluc skyrocketed to being one of the best niche DPS. Sucks to see his design playstyle go straight into the garbage, but it's good that you can expect him to be a competent main DPS again. 8 out of 10. Next is Diluc's self-proclaimed archenemy, Diona. Her shields and healing are pretty damn good for what they are, and using the Noblesse Force set effect can make her a decent utility character. 7 out of 10. Dori is a big nothing character. She has more uses at higher constellation, but the way I see it, she's just a shinobu that came out way too late. Even worse off is that she is burst reliant to use her healing, and her particle generation is mediocre at best. 4 out of 10. Emily is a character I don't think about a whole lot. Not that she sucks, but her role and release timing made her a bit forgettable. Hell, I forgot about her until after finishing most of this video. Nevertheless, she was the first character to primarily use burning, as before that, you'd have no reason to trigger it unless it was by accident. Emily doesn't do to the burning reaction what Nilou does to Bloom, but she does slightly buff its damage and use it as a means of unlocking her own raw damage. Nice that she doesn't need her burst to work either, and that it's more of an enhancement than it is a necessity. In gameplay though, that does come out to be kinda boring. 6 out of 10. Eula. You're kidding me if you think she's anything higher than B tier. Physical damage sucks, but at least she's the best of the worst archetype in the game? Well, besides that, she is entirely burst reliant to do any modicum of good damage, and her teams are usually built around giving her energy to hit that one bang burst, because if you miss it, you're restarting that chamber anyways. When it comes to fun factor, I mean, it's fun to hit a fat number, but besides that, she's pretty stale for me. But I should probably stop bullying the Eula mains. 6 out of 10. Farazan. My god, she sucks at base! Too high of an energy requirement, averaging 300% even with the Favonius Warbow. And for what? Just to make mediocre characters slightly better? And on the other side of the Constellation Hill is one of the better 4 stars in the game. Complete zero to hero story with Farazan at C6. So the investment will be hard as hell, but hey, she is at least the premier animal damage buffer. 6 out of 10. Fischl. It's been almost 4 years, and similar to Beto, Fischl never lost her presence no matter what the game state. As a part of the Genshin Big 5, Fischl is an amazing off-field damage dealer that can also serve as a team-wide particle generator. She only got better throughout the years with the release of Dendro and the Golden Troop artifact set. 9 out of 10. Just as an idea, Framine sounds fun, mixing in cryo and physical damage, and pretty much the first character to actually want to use the Shatter reaction. Can't say I've used him much, but he seems alright enough to want to use. Maybe I should, considering I have him C6'd. 6 out of 10. Next is the star of the show, Furina. I've given my opinions on her already, so if you want to hear more of that from me, I've got the right videos for you. But to sum it up, amazing buffs that take little to no effort to actually get, crazy good damage and flexibility, even opening up more options for other characters. One of the most flexible and simple support characters in the game that can still do her insane share of damage. 9 out of 10. Liyue's very own Wushu dancer Ga Ming brings a fun skill plunge playstyle, but he's closer to a flavor of the weak pyro character. He gets a lot after C6, but before that, he's serviceable to use should you want to change things up. 7 out of 10. As a half Qilin, Ganyu is quite literally the GOAT. Ganyu, ever since her release, has been a menace in melt and freeze teams. Her skill and burst are a thing, where her skill has a taunt effect to draw in enemies, and her burst spawns a shower of icicles for a good chunk of time, and having theoretically no cooldown if you get enough energy. But the real appeal is, of course, her charged attacks. Huge damage scaling on no cooldown whatsoever. But if you were to ask me how fun she is, that would depend on what you think fun is. Hitting big numbers, hella fun. Sitting there and charging a shot, the most boring gameplay style in existence in an action game. I'm not paying for her 6th constellation to fix that, so she ends up being one of my lazy characters. 8 out of 10. Goro. He's like Farazan, except he really only helps defense scaling Geo characters. So he's really only good for 3 characters. Don't get me wrong, He is the literal world to 2 of those 3. But the majority of Geo is underwhelming as hell, unless you've got some massive vertical investment into it. So he falls flat. Not to mention his particle generation is as weak as all get out. 4 out of 10. Hu Tao is probably the reason why a lot of people started playing the game. I, for one, couldn't care less about her besides the fact that she was stealing Deluxe Spotlight when she came out as the better on-field pyro DPS. Nevertheless, yeah. She did way more damage due to higher scaling overall, and the fact that she got an attack boost from her HP, which would average out to be about 3,000 with most builds. Only thing stopping her from feeling better was her charged attacks costing stamina, even though her main playstyle is using charged attacks. And of course, she burns her HP to get that attack boost, so there might need to be some thought in playing her. Small beans to someone who has a lot of characters, or her first constellation, but hey, still potential roadblocks. 8 out of 10. Jean was one of those cases where she had defined uses, but ones that no character really wanted or needed. Then Farina arrived, and since she's one of the best characters, being one of her best teammates gives Jean a huge boost in value. She's also got the spot for the main abuser of fall damage. For when you can't do a lot of damage yourself, you can get a straight 100k off of fall damage. 8 out of 10. The Rogue Samurai, Kaedehara Kazuha, still holds his place as one of the best support characters in the game. Now, initially, I didn't see the appeal in his first banner. This might make no sense to you, but hear me out. Back then, I was looking for a character that could somehow help my damage, whether that be through support or just dealing the damage themselves. Looking back now, holy am I glad I chose Kazuha over Shao. But I'll get to that when it's his turn. Kazuha was a part of my main character's best team, and damn, he helped a lot with his elemental damage boosting and crowd control. I still don't see the fun factor, but hey, he made my life a lot easier. Cavalry Captain Kaya is one of the characters of all time. Not bad, but also doesn't excel at anything. But hey, for a beginner character, he could have pulled an Amber, but he does pretty well for himself. 6 out of 10. Kamisato Ayaka. Genshin's star child, since her birth date is also the game's launch date. Ayaka made a name for herself before the game even came out, and for another year until she finally became available. She still holds her place as the premier freeze character, as her burst does some of the highest base damage in the game and just shreds enemies' HP. Unfortunately, freeze has been phasing out for a long time now, but her flat damage is often enough to clear content anyways. One nitpick is her sprint, but I find it easier to get around than Mona's. 7 out of 10. Kamisato Ayato, the leader of the Yashiro Commission. I'll say this very slowly. He's not bad, just mid. There are far better options for Hydro characters you might want to pull for over him. That doesn't mean he's bad, he's just not as strong. But his advantage is his Hydro coverage. With a circle that big, you'd be hard pressed to find an enemy that isn't wet. Oh, and he can randomly pull out some Boba if you're into that. 7 out of 10. Kaveh is actually one of the most pointless characters of all time. Just doesn't have any practical place in any team. He looks like he'd have been a good Bloom trigger because his skill makes Dendro cores around him explode. But the only way to make Bloom good is by using Nilou. But in doing that, she allows for different Dendro cores to spawn that explode immediately anyways. So he's redundant as hell. 3 out of 10. Keqing is another case of bad before Dendro. Okay, not necessarily bad per se, just not as good. With the introduction of Dendro though, Keqing has become a pretty good quick counter Hyper Bloom trigger. Her fast attacks lend a lot of value to aggravate, since it's not capped on how many times you can trigger it. My only gripe is that her charged attack, out of every sword user, is the only one to cost more stamina. 8 out of 10. Kirara is an amazing shielder that is little to nothing else. It sure is a fat shield. Only saying this because in the case of everything outside of aggravate, her Dendro application falls flat since it's not constant. It's just one big pool of Dendro right then and there, and that's it. Still, it is a thick shield. I guess you can run up walls with her hold skill, but it's still slow. 6 out of 10. Klee. Extremely convoluted, and ultimately not worth the effort put into trying to learn. I can do really well in mono pyro teams. Yeah, so can everyone else when their teammates are Xiangling, Kazuha, and Bennett. Okay, fine. To her credit, she's found a place in a Farina Forward Vaporized team. But how fun is that really? 4 out of 10. Kujo Sara, part of the Tenryou Commission. She's like Goro in that she's an element-specific support. She brings an attack buff to the table, tagging on a crit damage buff at C6. That said though, I say element-specific, but honestly she's more like a Raiden buffer. Other Electro characters will prefer to have some sustain or crowd control over a pure damage buffer. She's pretty good for a traditional burst Raiden build in that she's Electro, so just inherently more energy for the both of them, but also that Sara's burst costs 80 energy, fueling Raiden's resolve mechanic. At least she can do some crazy damage from that burst. 6 out of 10. Kuki Shinobu. Another character whose purpose wasn't entirely clear at first when she released. And of course, after Dendro came out, she became one of the greatest Quicken and Hyper Bloom triggers in the game with how long her skill lasts, and it doubles as a healing ability too. 8 out of 10. Layla's cool. I guess literally. Shielder! Again, kinda mid? 6 out of 10. Lisa is a bit of an odd case. I mean, she was never top tier unless you like climbing. Sorry, old joke. She does have a niche for being the only character to have an easy way to reduce enemies' defense. Besides that, she made waves with some Quicken or Hyper Bloom teams, but she's outclassed to hell. 5 out of 10. For being another free character, Lynette is a case of what you see is what you get. Not much more than off-field damage, but she's pretty alright at it. Certainly nothing compared to the animal supports, but she can hold her own. 6 out of 10. Linny fell flat for me, since he basically functions like Ganyu with gameplay that's even staler because he only wants to be in mono pyro teams. I passed on him twice already. I get that he's strong, but not the playstyle for me. 6 out of 10. Next up is the guy who came in a bit too late to matter for his assigned role, but a little too soon for the thing he's actually good at. Mika, on release, was another Goro or Farazan story. You know, ridiculously high ER requirements to buff a niche damage type, or in this case, Yola. But he's different in that he can heal. Not only that, but it's a party-wide healing effect that triggers whenever your on-field character hits a normal attack. Because of that, he's become one of the better healers for Farina boosting. Mona got completely shafted by two characters that came after her, giving her little to no purpose unless you don't have the other two. But you'll already know that. Only gimmick she had was abusing her damage buff for a big screenshot number. In practical gameplay though, not much to offer. Too slow of Hydra application, and her damage buff gets outshined by better characters. And a sprint that is pain incarnate. 5 out of 10. Nahida is the quintessential Dendro character, the absolute best. Easily accessible, long-lasting off-field application, stupid good damage from it, a burst that makes both of those things better, and gives an EM buff to the on-field character proportionate to her own. 9 out of 10. The boss of the Spina di Rosula, Navia, has skyrocketed to become the best Geo DPS in the game. Simple startup with little risk with some immense damage as the reward. Even though she follows a skill burst playstyle, she still makes use of her normal attacks, to make playing her never feel boring. Top that off with not purely being restricted to mono Geo teams, and she becomes a great universal DPS with a lot of diverse options and teammates. 9 out of 10. Yes. Neuvillette, the one-man army. He can do all the damage of a team by himself. He can ruin most endgame content by himself. You never have to bring a healer because he does that himself. Being Hydro is already a huge perk, and if you want to use a team, he just gets better. Only gripe is that he's not mechanically intensive to play, which isn't a bad thing, but does make him not as fun to play. 9 out of 10. Meilu opens up a niche playstyle by making a bad reaction good. What's good is that you don't need to level her talents at all. Just level her and max out her HP as much as possible, so she herself is cheap to build. The requirement for her to be any good though is by only having Hydro and Dendro characters on your team, so if you're lacking either of those, it'll be hard to have a good time. Especially without Nahida. It'll be like willingly walking into a minefield because you can die from it too! Might take a bit of getting used to, but she's definitely good in the right scenarios. 7 out of 10. You know, it's funny looking back how Ningguang was considered the true 6-star DPS 3 years ago, because now all she is mid. She's alright in the early game, sure, but late game? barely stacks up to the two off-field damage characters, and hardly offers anything to be worth using on an actual team besides holding the throwing tails. Kinda sad because I actually like how she plays, at C6 anyways. 6 out of 10. Noelle has seen a resurgence in value thanks to Farina. Having a character that can flexibly go on and off field, have a shield, do damage, and heal while doing damage was already amazing enough. The only reason why she wasn't that great before was that the numbers on all of those things were beaten out. But now that Farina is out, Noelle is an amazing driver character to use in her teams, and now adding team buffs to the mix. 8 out of 10. Chi-Chi is garbage. Complete and utter garbage. There is no logical reason as to why you should build her unless you're a newer player that isn't used to all the game mechanics and wants some healer to help. But at that point, I'd go to argue that Barbara's better for this and you're more likely to get her way earlier anyways. Chi-Chi heals. That's it. She doesn't do anything else better than any other character. In Genshin, you hardly ever need to cap out your HP bar. Most of the time, good enough healing is pretty damn good as it is. Chi-Chi just has a role in a character market that doesn't even exist, making it feel all the worse when you lose your next 50-50 to her. 3 out of 10. Wait, no character names start with P, huh? That's a surprise. Thought there'd be one by now. Moving on. The almighty Shogun Raiden A. Raiden was probably the second Archon that felt like an Archon to me. It actually felt like she was the only character that could do what she did, giving a team-wide elemental burst damage buff and using the total energy burned by other characters' burst to fuel the damage of her own via the resolve mechanic. On top of that, the burst itself will refund flat energy to the team depending on how much resolve she has. Then she got better with Dendro, fueling both Quicken and Hyperbloom teams. So you not only get one of the best batteries in the game by pulling her, you also get some electro application with almost infinite range as far as an Abyss Chamber is concerned. 9 out of 10. Razor has been an interesting character. I mean, first off, let's get this out of the way. Playing him as a physical DPS, as the devs intended, has got to be one of the worst feelings known to man. Razor doesn't do enough damage to be worth the clunkiness of facilitating it. But then came a community-made archetype after Dendro, coined as Thundering Fury. Excusing the name, this makes Razor fairly fun to play, mixing a variety of reactions for its damage, including Quicken, Bloom, Hyperbloom, and Burgeon to name a few at play. Because of that, I'm willing to give him a few extra points in the fun factor, but he can still struggle with energy rotations, so 6 out of 10. Rosaria is the better Kaya in my opinion. Wider range of cryo application, higher damage ceiling, with passives to boost the team's crit rate based on her own. 7 out of 10. Sangonomiya Kokomi has a funny backstory, and the leading cause of it is because she is highly discouraged from being able to crit. And that's what set players off about her the first time. I personally didn't get it since she was clearly a character with a different role in mind other than doing damage. But yeah, she heals pretty well. She applies Hydro, which is also good, and even saw a redemption arc with Nilu's release. All in all, pretty solid character. Bonus point for being able to walk on water. 8 out of 10. Sayu is like a free-to-play Jean with an asterisk to me. Strictly speaking, she's an animal healer that scales off attack, but her skill does set her apart from Jean. You can basically get up to 10 seconds of full swirl that you can run through enemies with, and in that right, it can get to be pretty fun. But in all honesty, I'd much rather use Jean. 6 out of 10. I can't say much about Sethos personally since I don't have him yet, but from what I've seen, he seems to be a more fun version of Sino with shorter rotations and not nearly as many problems with doing his job as Sino has. So he gets a pass on that alone. 7 out of 10. Shenhe is the all-in-one premier cryo damage buffer, but it doesn't just end there. She also gives a buff to your primary damage sources, normal, charged, and plunging attack, along with elemental skill and burst as well. Don't get it twisted. She still primarily buffs cryo damage, and is the best at that by far. But hey, she can be more general than the other specific elemental supports, giving her the edge. 7 out of 10. Shikanoin Heizo could have been a fun character that does ridiculous damage, but from my perspective, they got half of that right. His damage only seemingly comes in at C6. Before that, he's got a fun gimmick, but it doesn't go further than that. 6 out of 10. Sijween Hydro Chi-Chi. Hydro is better than Cryo, and even more so in Sijween's case since she can work in Nilu teams. But ultimately, all she does is heal. 5 out of 10. Sucrose is the true box standard Animo character. Crowd control? Check. Swirl damage? Check. Support passives? Double check. Thrilling Tales? Ultimate check. She is the most accessible, most potent elemental damage buffer because of her ability to buff your party's EM by a portion of her own, making her incredibly valuable and versatile. 9 out of 10. Tartaglia. Child. Ajax. The primary reason why I stuck with this game back 3 years ago when I was feeling the urge to quit. He presents some of the most rewarding intensive gameplay styles in the game, having to keep track of his Riptide, properly cycling through your team, and of course, his cooldown. All of that might sound annoying to you, but he was exactly the type of character I was looking for at the time, and he has held up tremendously well over the course of 3 years. The theoretical chain reaction of Riptides you could pull off still makes him the best Hydro applicator in the game to date. The most fun I've had with a character even now. Personally, he's a 10 out of 10 for me. Toma is a shielder, but the way he works is a little unconventional. So he can get a shield that's small, but is stackable to become more durable. Granted, his shielding can be enough to use as a stagger resistance, but I wouldn't recommend it as your only form of sustain. The other side effect of it is that it will shoot out waves of pyro with every normal attack you do, which ends up making him good for facilitating Burgeon. So through that, you can actually get a pretty decent Burgeon trigger if you have a healer that can tank the incoming damage coming from enemies and his Dendro cores. His energy requirements can feel like a bit much though, and they only go down via some of his later constellations. 7 out of 10. Tighnari is one of the better characters in the standard banner pool, offering simple gameplay with some great results out of it. You will need somewhat expensive teammates to back him up, but he's great once you get him going. His gameplay mostly focuses on charged attacks, and if you recall, I don't like charged attack playstyles on ranged characters. So yeah, despite Tighnari being good, I'm gonna have to give him a 7 out of 10. Okay, Traveler time. Animo, decent at the start of the game, not much else. 3 out of 10. Geo, outclassed, and those rocks can't even do damage after being spawned unless you've got Zhongli. 4 out of 10. Electro, I mean, kinda alright, offering a pseudo Beidou character, but at that point, use Beidou. 3 out of 10. Dendro, the GOAT of Travelers thus far. Very good Dendro applicator if you don't have Nahida. Does have some caveats like an order of operations when it comes to their burst, but besides that, solid character. 8 out of 10. Hydro, you're funny. Heavily outclassed by Xingqiu, and has a moving water bubble that doesn't even stop like Ayaka's Blizzard, making it highly unreliable or just useless. 2 out of 10. So, stick with Dendro. It's the best Traveler so far unless the Pyro one wants to prove me wrong. Venti is a funny character. He went from the most OP character back in version 1 to the reason why enemies have been getting heavier and why more bosses show up in the Spiral Abyss. He's also one of the most forgotten. At least that's the way I see it. And I have him, for crying out loud. Yeah, Kazuha just kinda does everything better than Venti. Never minding that Venti doesn't have any supportive abilities he can trigger when he swirls. He does damage, but not nearly as effectively as he could have done before. 5 out of 10. Wander, God, f this. That's pretty much how you're gonna feel after playing him without a shield. Since his main gimmick is his aerial combat, he can get knocked around a lot. Pairing that with the fact that he does animal damage, you get where I'm going. C6 Farzan is basically required for him to see his full potential, which means he's mediocre otherwise. But my god, is his damage not worth the pain of being knocked back. 6 out of 10. Wriothesley is like Hazel, but good. He's another one of those melee catalyst characters. He's fun for sure, but with a little clunkiness at C0 that makes him feel incomplete. He mainly wants to do normal attacks, and the ones powered up by his skill will drain his own HP, giving him synergy with Farina and the Marushose Hunter set, sure. But he wants to stay above 50% HP for his skill to buff him at all. But at C0, he also wants to stay under 60% HP for his unique charged attack that does extra damage and heals him. While the charged attack isn't enough of a boost to overpower his primary normal attack playstyle, it still feels weird to not be able to use a part of his moveset. At base at least. Besides that, he's cool, literally. Can be the driver for forward or reverse melt teams, and you can do some funky Dendro stuff too if you feel like it. 7 out of 10. Xiangling is the absolute queen of free-to-play damage. You can get a copy of her from clearing a lower level of the Spiral Abyss. Big point right there. Her sheer power when paired with Bennett is ridiculous and has kept her extremely relevant since the game's release, all due to snapshotting. Snapshotting means she can take buffs from when she casts an ability and carry it right to the end of it, even if she loses those buffs at any point during it. Being incredibly simple to use and slot into teams has certainly helped her notoriety as well. Never mind only getting stronger as the game goes on. I mean, yeah, she is the only major source of off-field pyro damage, but that's not to take anything away from her at all. 9 out of 10. Scion reinvented the wheel and gave every character a new lifestyle they could play around with, outshining Xiao in every possible way. Xiao, which I'll get to in a sec, was the only plunge DPS before Scion, so that unfortunately made him the best by default. But that wasn't saying much. Being Animo isn't the greatest when you're trying to be a hypercarry DPS, since you don't have any reactions that multiply your damage. What you see once is kinda what you get. But since Shen gave everyone else the ability to high jump, that opened up new team comps that completely on Xiao's damage, and threw Diluc back into relevancy. What's more, she makes an amazing companion for Farina because her burst can heal your entire party. Of course, she made a great teammate for Xiao, but she does way more for anyone that can abuse, vaporize, or melt. 8 out of 10. Speaking of the Conqueror of Demons, Xiao is up. He runs into the same problem as Wanderer, being Animo, except this one has an energy problem. Due to being a burst-reliant hypercarry, you're generally building a team around him to maximize his capabilities. Thing is, the team you'd need to build for him to be good can get overly expensive for the damage you get out of it. In this perfect team, most of everything is accounted for. Perfect energy cycles, flexible enough damage buffing to make him viable, and a healer to negate his self-drain. Without those 3 other characters though, he feels like a piece of He is, to date, the only burst-reliant character that can't generate energy particles in his burst state to fuel the next rotation. His damage is extremely mediocre to the point where you'd rather be playing someone else, and you lose all the flexibility of the damage and healing buff since he's tied to Bennett as a buffer/healer. That's usually not a problem for most teams, but Xiao makes it a problem! His plunge attack knocks away enemies, so he has to constantly chase them down to do damage and chase them down again! He forces you to bring out the pinnacle of positional awareness for little to no reward in playing like that. Personally speaking, if a character needs another character to be C6'd, with 2 other premium 5-star supports to not feel like shit to play, they're garbage to me. 4 out of 10. On a more positive note, Xingqiu is f***ing goated! He is one of the best characters in the game next to Bennett, hands down. Xingqiu is pretty much the only 4-star Hydro character that's undoubtedly good. He's got some amazing off-field Hydro application that does pretty good damage whenever your active character uses normal attacks. Passive Hydro application just by standing next to enemies via his orbital rain swords, incoming damage reduction from those rain swords, and some minor but appreciated healing when those rain swords break. That's all at C0. With a few constellations, he can have more Hydro application, Hydro res reduction, another rain sword for that damage reduction, and more damage! To sum it up, Xingqiu is the all-reliable character for all your Hydro needs. 10 out of 10. Now back to the mediocre. Xinyan looks like a confused mess of a character if you were to read her talent descriptions, but as it turns out, she's not a confused mess, she's just underwhelming. Let me break it down. She's a pyro character that primarily wants to do physical damage and has shields as a bonus. There are 2 things stopping her from being viable. First, she's a pyro character that wants to do physical damage, when pyro isn't involved in superconduct whatsoever. Secondly, her shield scales off of her defense, which means if you're building her for damage, which scales off of her attack, that shield is going to break in no time at all. Her physical damage ends up being nothing with Yola existing, on top of the fact that even if you were to run her as a pyro DPS, her damage easily gets lapped by Xiangling's and most other DPS's. She can't have a single cake to eat, and you throw in another one to boot. What is the purpose of this character being playable? 2 out of 10. The head of the Grand Narukami Shrine, Yae Migo, is pretty damn good. She's an off-field electro DPS who does incredible damage with her Sessho Sakura turrets that have a super wide range, almost to the point where it targets cooking pots. Stop that. In essence, a second Fischl. Well, not quite, but you get the point. Being a Catalyst character means that you can have electro damage on demand and do more damage because of it. She's also the reason why I now hear these voices in my head.
Emerge, right now, emerge.
8 out of 10. Yanfei is a decently good pyro main DPS with the sub-role of being a serviceable HP scaling shielder at C4. She has a simple gameplay loop and does enough damage to be worth considering. 6 out of 10. After 1.0, the number of good 4-stars being released was small or non-existent. until Yao Yao came along. You know, about 2 years after the fact. Yao Yao is Dendro, and what's more, she heals, and that healing is pretty good too. Her burst does give some resistance to incoming Dendro damage, which doesn't matter a lot of the time, but can come in clutch for those Nilou Bloom or Burgeon teams. Not much more to say other than that she's a solid character overall, 8 out of 10. Yelan is what you get if you take all of the defensive utility from Xingqiu and just double down on damage. She doesn't offer any damage reduction, and her Hydro application is even a little less potent, but that's not to say she isn't good. In return, she does more damage and gives your active character a damage buff, which also includes herself. Now that might sound like you're sacrificing one thing for the other, but what's stopping you from using these two together? Nothing at all. Hell, they're even better when used together since one can scrounge up energy for the other's burst. Her skill is some of the most fun I've had from holding a single button. Dash through enemies, tie them up, and have them all explode when you release it. And it's a lifesaver when it comes to overworld exploration too. She gets an honest 9 out of 10 from me. Yoimiya is kind of an unfortunate character. Not because she's bad or anything, I'm talking more about her release schedule. Every time she gets a banner, it's always either before an Archon's release or during it, meaning that people feel the FOMO really badly around these times and just skip Yoimiya out of virtue that she's pretty mid. Not the bad kind, just that the Archons next to her are probably better value. Yoimiya was the first in the using an elemental skill to infuse or buff left-click spam character mold, and by no means is she the worst at it either. But when she's commonly compared to someone like Hu Tao and probably Arlecchino now, she doesn't really stand a chance. That's not even getting into the auto-targeting issue she has as a bow character either. Again, perfectly fine character, just really unfortunate timing on the re-releases. 7 out of 10. Yunjin is probably the most niche of the niche supports, realistically only helping out 2 characters at the time I'm writing this video. And while I realize there can be more, only Yoimiya and Ayato really come to mind. She buffs normal attacks. Only normal attacks. At least she's good at it, but that's all she does. Pretty good for the characters she does buff, but outside of it, not much else to offer. 6 out of 10. And of course, last but not least, is the CEO of GEO. Zhongli. Yes, he's still the best defensive support in the game, with a shield that is very hard to break, if not unbreakable. He gives universal red shroud on enemies, and can work everywhere since Geo is basically element neutral. He may not be the character you want to use to clear something fast, but he will be the safest. 9 out of 10. Okay, I lied. Since this video is taking long enough to make anyways, let's include some of the early Natlan characters. Starting off, Mualani. She's the first character to have slow enough but also explosive enough Hydro damage to be a dedicated forward Vaporize trigger. So what's the big deal? Forward Vaporize, which is Hydro on Pyro, deals more damage than reverse Vaporize, Pyro on Hydro. Because of this, you can build a team around Vaporize that prioritizes higher Pyro application instead of Hydro. Now, this does mean that you're slightly more limited in your setups, but the big damage you get from Mualani is worth the sacrifice. To top it off, she's easy to build, fully scaling on HP %, and easy to play assuming you have some interruption resistance like what you can get from Dea. 8 out of 10. Kachina is a case of being a pure set buffer. Her damage isn't at the point of being worth the investment, but she doesn't have a stat to scale off of to be useful, so you might as well build her for damage. Back to the point though, since she is from Natlan, she can abuse the massive buffs from the Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City set. God, that's a mouthful. Anyways, this set gives a 40% elemental damage bonus to any elements involved in a reaction triggered by the wielder. That's a lot. Hell, even more than the buff from an average Kazuha build, just to give an idea of how much that is. But that's pretty much all she's worth, so she ends up being a 5 out of 10. Kinich is a pretty good DPS, however gimmicky. He's a raw Dendro DPS that wants to use the burning or burgeon reactions. He brings a unique tethered playstyle that does a ton of raw damage, and just using the mentioned reactions to extend the window of time he has to do that big damage. Not much more outside of that. He's interesting, just not my thing when it comes to actually playing him. 7 out of 10. Shilonen is the second coming of Kazuha, and that's not hyperbole in the slightest. Shilonen can debuff enemies' elemental resistance based on the elements in your party, which isn't reliant on having the element applied on them, so that's already a big improvement over the Viridescent set in that aspect. An added bonus is that her burst is an on-field heal over time that moves with the character and isn't restricted to being stuck in or around a circle. But since she's from Natlan, she also gets to use that Cinder City set, making her supportive role on a team absolutely crazy to the point where you'd think Hoyo releasing her was a mistake. Nevertheless, those effects are easy to trigger and extremely powerful, skyrocketing her to the position of one of the best characters in the game. Basically comes out to a side grade to Kazuha. What you lose in grouping with Kazuha, you get in healing with Shilonen. I also find it funny that she'll buff pretty much every element except for Dendro and Anemo. Emphasis on Anemo. Another L for the Scion one remains. 9 out of 10. Here's my final tier list for every character in this video. Characters aren't ordered in their ranks, and if you have any disagreements with my opinions, put them in a comment. Alright then, see ya.